Hey everyone, it's Lisa. Thanks for joining me today and welcome to my sewing lair. I have a couple of projects on the board. The one on the right is the finished quilt top. I made this from scraps, from 4-patch scraps that I had on hand, and where I didn't have enough 4 patches, I augmented them with some of the peach fabric that I used in the setting. And then I cobbled together what I could and filled in the rest with a very simple checkerboard. I decided to use an alternate block setting, which I like very much. I think adds a lot of visual interest without adding complexity of borders and stuff. So I basically put my blocks on point. The other thing that I did on the quilt on the right, I used my flying geese units. I used them up as well as I could, and I have one of these units where I pointed the flying goose outside, the goose nose to the outside versus the inside, and swapped out the blocks to be solid. And you'll see that in, I'm trying to point right here. But I don't like extra seams in a block, and I would much prefer to do it in an economy block or using corner setting triangles versus, adding squares in. You get the same block, you just get less seams, and I prefer less seams. To use this method, it's really very easy, and I'm going to put a link to the All People Quilt PDF on corner setting triangles and side setting triangles. It is one of the most useful things that I have in my sewing resources, because I always refer to it as a refresher, and I would suggest that you do too. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. On this particular quilt, I on the right, I just had enough blocks to make it 4 by 3, and I wanted a square quilt, so I just added the checkerboard, the 4 patches, to these 10-inch finished blocks, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I didn't feel the need to put additional checkerboarding around it, and I'm just going to leave it just as it is. The quilt on the left is, I found six pinwheel blocks rather of some fabric that I had made, and frankly, they're not very great pinwheels, and that's okay. They're not great, but I elected to use them, and to get again a large enough footprint. I have a theme here. To get a large enough footprint, I set them on point. So I was lazy, and I said, okay, I'm just going to pair, and I had enough fabric. So, you have to go with the resources you have. That's why I call this part of my Swedish Death Quilting. It's like, what do I have? What can I make? So for this fabric, which I bought a lot of because I bought it at a ridiculous price, the teal with the dots in it, and I'm down to my last bit of it. So I elected to just use solid color blocks and set them on point to go with my pinwheels. And you can see already that it's creating a very pleasing effect. This is not a complicated quilt to do, and if you wanted to just have a go-to baby quilt, this would be an easy one to undertake. Now, why do I keep harping on this, on point business? Well, the on point business, in my view, is the easiest way that a quilter can get more square footage on their block than any other method. So setting a block on point is a corner setting triangle. That's all it is, which is a half square triangle. The hardest thing that you have to do, and it's not very hard, is to figure out what size it needs to be. And I see so many people go around their elbow to scratch their backside to keep you from doing the math. And I'm going to tell you, learn how to do the math. I keep banging on something on my quilt table. Sorry. Learn how to do the math so that you are your own master. And the math is very simple. You are dealing with the square root of 2, which is 1.414. That is like the golden measure for quilters is 1.414, the square root of 2. And that number is going to help you either size your square or size your diagonal, depending on how you use it. If you are dividing by 1.414, you are calculating excuse me, you're calculating the size of the square that you need to cut. And that's what we're doing here for these corner setting triangles. And why are they called corner setting? Well, you've got a square, and when you add a half square triangle to it, you create a corner. So it's a corner setting square. Now, if you have two squares together and you're having to fill in a triangle on the edge of your quilt, that's a side setting triangle. So if you learn those two simple things, you are your own master. So I had these blocks and I basically put 2 rounds of corner setting triangles, square in square. That's what that is doing for you. And it's very easy. You determine your finished block size. So any block you have, even if your block is goofy, if you have a 2 3/4 inch block, the math is all the same. Now you may end up with, numbers that don't end up on your calculator or they always end up on your calculator, but they may not end up on your ruler. You have to be mindful of that. So I started with my 5-inch blocks in the center. They actually finished at 4.5, and I did my math from there. And frankly, I ended up with having to work with some 1/8, and I didn't really care for that too much, but my blocks were so out of wonk, I had to do that. Nevertheless, you take your finished block size, you divide by 1.414, and you add 7/8 of an inch to it. I always add 1 inch so that I have something to trim down. Anytime you're working with bias, remember the mantra, when you're working with bias, a little bit of wonk creates big wonk, whether it's in your cutting, whether it's in your sewing, and whether it's in your pressing. If you fail on any of those 3 measures, you could end up with a block that toes in. If it toes out, that's fine. Your ruler will just slice that away. But if it's toeing in, you're going to be short on your block, and you don't want that. So it's, I call it mere mortal math, to add enough in there so that you can trim it down. So on this block, that's all I did. I just used alternating color schemes, interior white, exterior dark, and then interior dark, exterior white. And you can see that it's going to produce a really pleasing pattern here, and I'm really happy with it. So anyway, I did want to share that with you, and I wanted to share that resource. So I'm sorry that I harp on these things, but it just it's just important to me that people feel like they can do the mastery, and that so much I think of quilting seems so secretive and reduced to rulers that you have to buy, which, trust me, I love rulers, but you should get to know the math. And even if you're using specialty rulers, because you will oftentimes want to make blocks that may not be listed on your ruler. And that's what I did here for what I had to do on my trim down. There was no ruler that's going to help me do that. I needed to do the math and then trim accordingly. All right, that's it for me. I hope that you're working on a project that's fun, or if it's frustrating, that you're learning something from it. Thanks again for being with me, and I'll see you soon with some other nerdy content.